This is the second in a series of blood sugar basics. So buckle up because I'm going to do my best to explain some basic nutrition and metabolism without the benefit of the visual aids that I usually use in my programs. So what I'm hoping you'll learn from this particular episode is what types of food impact blood sugar, what a carbohydrate even is, and how your carbohydrate foods are digested and absorbed to become the glucose that gets into our bloodstream and is blood glucose. So this really is an episode for the newcomer. And if you find yourself not understanding a lot of the lingo around blood sugar, insulin, diabetes, metabolic syndrome, my hope is that this 3-part series, that this is the second of, will give you some much needed foundations. And in the spirit of keeping it basic, I will be oversimplifying some concepts with the understanding that you'll be able to use this episode as sort of scaffolding upon which to hang future information. So let's dive in with some Nutrition 101. Macronutrients is the place to start. Macronutrients is the place to start because when you hear the term macros, you hear the term macros thrown around a lot. And that's referring to macronutrients. And these are the big nutrients in our diet. And the big nutrients are protein, fat, and carbohydrates. Those make up macronutrients. Contrast this with micronutrients, and those are our vitamins and minerals. So those are the macros. The macros are the ones that come with calories, if you will. They can all be used to make energy in a pinch. So when we're talking about blood sugar, I want to make a few things really clear before we dive in. First, blood glucose and blood sugar are the same thing. Glucose is the form of sugar that our body uses for fuel, and we can get that. And we can use the terms blood sugar and blood glucose interchangeably, and I will during this episode. Second, blood sugar is impacted primarily by carbohydrates, not protein and fat. And third, this is an oversimplification of the picture because there are instances where protein can contribute to blood sugar rises. But for our purposes here, we're going to keep it simple and just assume it's only dietary carbohydrates that break down and elevate blood glucose. The protein bit, that's Nutrition 201. So let's zoom in on carbohydrates. First, just a chemistry thing, carbohydrates are made from carbon and water, carbohydrate. Plants make them from carbon dioxide and water and use sunlight to combine the two and make glucose. And that's where we get all of our carbohydrates. And you can subdivide this category of carbohydrates into a few other categories. The two main ones we'll talk about are simple carbohydrates or simple sugars and complex carbohydrates or starch. And I would like you to set aside thinking of these as good or bad because, I know we're taught a lot to avoid simple sugars. But this is just a chemistry lesson right now. So we're just going to stick with the chemistry of thinking about simple sugars and complex carbohydrates to understand some of this. So simple sugars. These can also be divided into mono and disaccharides. And yes, this is going to get really terminology, but I'll give you a too long didn't read summary at the end. So just stop taking notes and go with me. So simple sugars can be mono or disaccharides, mono being 1, di being 2. The basic components of carbohydrates, the smallest molecules, are monosaccharides, and they include glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, you will see just glucose in nature. Mostly you see just fructose in nature because that's fruit sugar. You see that in like ripe mangoes and figs, and it's super sweet. Galactose you don't tend to see by itself, but you will see that galactose in combination with glucose because when you put them together, the two monosaccharides, they become a disaccharide called lactose. And that's where the disaccharides are. They're just pairing up the monosaccharides into different disaccharides. So if you put glucose and galactose together, they become lactose, which is milk sugar. Yes, milk has sugar, and it does really raise your blood sugar. Another popular disaccharide is sucrose, which is a combination of glucose and fructose together. So those are the monos. The thing about these simple sugars is that they don't require much, if any, digestion, especially the monosaccharides. You imagine especially if you drink them in juice, you just take them in and whoop, in they go. You might as well be mainlining these guys. Even the disaccharides, you've got little brush border enzymes. Brush border meaning on your intestine, on the surface of your intestine, there's little enzymes that just sort of split apart those disaccharides and whoop, in they go. They get absorbed. So it's really straightforward. You eat them, they're absorbed pretty quick. And also, when you eat them, they generally pass through the stomach pretty quickly. Because you think about your whole digestive tract, you chew the food, goes through your esophagus, into your stomach, and from your stomach drops into your small intestine where it's absorbed into the bloodstream. But the stomach, it's got acid in there and some enzymes to break down protein. But the sugars, the starches, nothing really happens to them in the stomach. Not enough. And so if you don't have any protein or fat in your meal, your stomach's not going to hold on to those sugars very long. So they're just going to, do not pass go, do not collect your $200. You digest your starches in your mouth and in your small intestine. So simple sugars in and absorbed. But the second type of carbohydrate is a starch, aka complex carbohydrates. Again, I'm going to use those two terms interchangeably. Starches are found in foods like grains, all grains, legumes, peas, lentils, beans, and starchy vegetables like roots, parsnips, carrots, potatoes, sweet potatoes. Now, what's interesting about these complex carbohydrates is they are basically just a long, complex chain of glucose molecules, all hooked together in a complex fashion. So, a starch in a potato is just glucose, 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 all linked together, branches and everything like that. That's it. In fact, some people like to say a carb's a carb. It's all sugar when it hits your bloodstream. And so it doesn't matter if you eat a starch or if you eat sugar. And there's definitely some truth in there. But the difference comes with the speed with which they are absorbed. So you probably have already guessed this, but while a simple sugar like eating fructose, if you have a soda that's just high fructose corn syrup, it'll get absorbed very quickly. But the starches require more digestion because that long branch chain of glucose requires enzymes to split it into smaller units. Now, some of those enzymes are in the mouth, but most of that happens in the intestine. And so it just kind of has to sit there while it cleaves off, 1 and 2 glucose molecules at a time, and then it gets absorbed. So if you just ate pure starch, it's still going to raise your blood sugar considerably, but it's still kind of like a time-release version of glucose, of juice. Now, there is a third type of carbohydrate you might have heard of, and that is fiber. So fiber is unusual. It is structurally a carbohydrate, but it's unusual that our body can actually not digest and absorb it. So it does not contribute to a rise in blood sugar. However, much of it can be consumed by bacteria in our intestine, hopefully our large intestine, our colon. And when bacteria consume and break down fiber, it's called fermentation. And the helpful strains of bacteria in our colon eat this fiber, and then they produce short chain fatty acids like butyrate, propionate, there's different ones. And that short chain fatty acid serves as a fuel source for the cells lining our intestine. And they help signal to regulate our body, produce essential nutrients, and manage our immune system and blood sugar regulation. And this is why fiber is great. It's a carbohydrate that doesn't impact our blood sugar. It is consumed by bacteria who then produce the food to nourish our intestinal cells and regulate our health. So essentially, we are thriving off of bacterial poop. So in summary, we have 3 types of carbohydrates which come from plants: simple sugars, the mono and disaccharides, the complex carbohydrates, starches, in grains, legumes, starchy vegetables, and fiber, which you can't digest, but your gut bacteria can, and that's good. So now let's pivot and talk about the process of digestion and how we break these down and absorb it into our blood, because this will help you understand some of our blood sugar hacks. So I alluded to this earlier in the way the stomach is set up and how quickly things happen. But, it's not very often in real life that we just eat carbohydrates. Most actual food whole foods is a combination of carbohydrates, maybe some fiber, protein, fat, and other things. But understanding the process of digestion is helpful because when you're trying to balance your blood sugar and, have healthy digestion, and let me remind you that having a healthy digestion is kind of the critical to health, because in order to get nutrients, you need to be able to digest your food, absorb it properly, reduce inflammation. So this is pretty basic. But I want to highlight the key parts of your digestion so you can understand how some of our hacks work. So let's think about eating white rice. Not bad, not good. That's pretty close to being a straight up starch, straight up complex carbohydrate. So first, when you eat that white rice, you're going to chew it. And when you're chewing it, it is partially broken down by your teeth and the amylase enzyme in your saliva. So there's enzymes that break down starch in your saliva. So chewing starts to break it down. When you swallow, it goes down your esophagus and into your stomach. That stomach, like I said earlier, has acid and mostly enzymes which deal with protein. So there isn't a lot to offer starch here. So because that happens further down. So if you eat plain rice, it's not going to spend long in the stomach at all. The stomach will empty it out pretty quickly into the small intestine. When it's in the small intestine, a bunch of stuff happens. Your pancreas adds bicarb to neutralize that acid that comes from the stomach. And it also sends enzymes that help start breaking down the starch and whatever else is in there. Now, the gallbladder hopefully will squirt some bile in there, but not as much if there's no fat in the meal. The gallbladder really responds well to fat and bitter flavors. Then it's here in the small intestine. This is where the starches will be broken down into glucose molecules, into their basic units, and absorbed into the bloodstream. So they get out of the tube, that's the small intestine, and they go into the blood, and that's when blood glucose levels will start to rise until it's all absorbed. Yeah, and you'll see this on your continuous glucose monitor. It starts going up. And then whatever undigestible fiber there is continues down to the large intestine, where the bacteria will ferment it and make all their goodies that we love. So, got it? Great. Let's add some fiber to that meal. Let's say in addition to that rice, you added some black beans. And I know black beans have other things in them, but these black beans are going to add a fair bit of soluble fiber. Now, this soluble fiber absorbs water and forms a type of gel that will slow the digestion of these starches. It kind of like gets in the way, this goop. And that means those starches get absorbed more slowly into your bloodstream, sort of flattening the blood sugar curve. And we all know what flattening the curve means now. So let's go one step further and let's add some protein to that meal. And yes, I know there's protein in black beans, but I'm trying to be simple, and that's just the example I came up with. Let's eat a few bites of high protein food like some salmon, egg, or chicken. Just a few bites of maybe we get like 10, 20 grams of protein of chicken before we take a bite of rice. So high protein food comes in first. And when you eat that high protein food like chicken or an egg, it changes things even more. Remember, in order to digest protein fully, you can imagine now it needs to spend a lot of time in the stomach, in that acidic environment that denatures the protein, opens it up so that the enzymes present in the stomach can start breaking that protein down. Protein's harder to digest. And because of this, when you eat that protein, it sends various hormone signals that tell your stomach, hold on to that food, slow down gastric emptying, slow down stomach emptying. So it's like, again, it's like it time releases and just drips that food, that partially digested stomach juice. It will slow down releasing that into your intestine because it wants to keep the protein in there longer. And that means anything you eat after that protein, even if it's right after that protein, will also get stuck in that traffic jam. You just created a bit of a traffic jam. And so if that is rice, it gets absorbed more slowly. It still gets absorbed, but again, you're flattening that curve even more. So if you can imagine white rice by itself being kind of like a Mount Fuji peak, goes up rapidly, comes down rapidly. And then if you add some fiber to that, it looks more like a Mount St. Helens. That's my local mountain, Mount St. That's Mount St. Helens before it erupted, I should say, the nice snow cone. And then if you add protein to that, you end up with a Mount St. Helens after the eruption where it's much more flat. So you can, that's the effect that we're getting here. So if you're wondering why you want to flatten the blood sugar curve, I mean, I'm assuming you knew that was the whole point. But the reason you want to flatten that blood sugar is this. Just like keeping a steady temperature in your body and a steady pH, the body needs to maintain a relatively constant blood sugar range. This is called homeostasis. If blood sugar goes too high, it damages things, your eyes, your kidneys, your blood vessels, and it damages it sometimes irreversibly in some cases. And if it's too low, you lose consciousness. Like that can be a fatal thing if it goes too low. And so whenever you cause it to go far out of range, your body has to work like mad to bring it back into equilibrium. And this causes stress. And most people I find the people I work with, I should say many, not most, people find they feel much better keeping their blood sugar more steady, less erratic, and more tightly controlled. It doesn't have to be flat. So for some people, like a therapeutic ketogenic diet, flat is therapeutic and changes lives, 100%. And you heard that from my interview with Nicole a few episodes ago. But for most people, just keeping it as steady rolling hills rather than a series of Mount Fujis. And you know the hangry feeling? The hangry where you're hungry and you're angry and agitated all at the same time? That hangry feeling is generally the come down from a big adrenaline surge, which is what your body does when you're recovering from a blood sugar crash. So some people don't realize they're having blood sugar crashes, but they feel hangry, which they think is normal because, Snickers actually made an entire successful marketing campaign out of the hangry feeling. But it is common, but so is dysregulated blood sugar. That hangry feeling is a result of a blood sugar crash. And people who feel hungry frequently really benefit from regulating their blood sugar better. And this is why you'll hear people, including me, talk about the order of eating. People talk about eating protein or fiber first and not to eat a naked carb. That's something I think you hear a lot now. All the carbohydrates still get absorbed, but it goes in more slowly and helps your body stay closer to equilibrium with more steady energy levels and less stress. And aside from the long-term benefits, which are massive, you actually feel better and have more energy. So if you listen to episode 1, the very first episode in this podcast, I shared my top 3 blood sugar hacks, and following the order of eating was always on that. And I always tell people you need more protein. Most of the people who come to me, because they need help with their diets, when I evaluate things, they are inevitably not eating enough protein. And I'm usually being pretty conservative. So I always tell them, you've got to eat it anyways. So do yourself a favor and eat a few bites of this high protein food first. Also, it fills you up. So by eating protein first at every meal, it helps you regulate your appetite more and build some muscle. Lots of reasons. And you might as well get some fiber in too. Fun fact, growing up, my own family did not eat out very often. It's expensive. My mom just, cooked. We had leftovers. But when we did go out, my mom always advised me to eat the expensive food first. In other words, she did not want to catch me filling up on cheap bread and leaving an expensive steak on my plate. And so in practice, I've noticed that this eating expensive food first also works in balancing blood sugar, because you're going to eat the more expensive and more nutritious protein and fiber, vegetable sources, and then leave that breadbasket for later. And if you're like some people I know, popping it in the handbag to take it home. So in practice, I've noticed that this strategy does lead my patients not only to balancing their blood sugar better, it means they're more likely to eat an adequate amount of protein and increase their fiber and vegetable intake, which is why I often don't go into all this detail, but I just tell them the order of eating, try it out, see how you feel. And if they're using a continuous glucose monitor, they notice right away it really helps. But I think there is just as much benefit in noticing that it makes you feel better. So that, in a rather large nutshell, is the basics of that carbohydrate digestion process. From the food to breaking it down and absorbing it as glucose. I hope it was useful. If you want a more detail on this and are a person who likes visuals and want to know how this works, I actually have this as an online program. I've kind of given you a good chunk of one of the modules in my Nutrition 101 Metabolic Reset. In that online program, it goes over actually more detail about digestion and improving digestion, all about carbohydrates, all about protein, all about fat, what you need, handouts, how much. It really helps you dial it in. Very good. And I'll put a link to that in the description here, but you can always find it on my website, hackyourbloodsugar.com, under classes, Nutrition 101, Metabolic Reset. It's a little bit more like Nutrition 201, frankly, but it does cover the basics and you'll be a pro. So if you stay tuned for next one, in the next episode, we'll be talking about how insulin works. What happens now that glucose in the bloodstream? How does it get into the cell? What's the role of insulin? More about insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome, prediabetes, and how that evolves. And this is where it gets really interesting. So I hope you will join me for that. Thanks for listening.